too. If you're coming in, please come in now. There is some space down the front. So yeah, please come in. Don't be shy. A couple of notes. If you end up in the overflow room one week, that's room 192. At the end of that class, we've got to remember to put the furniture back in place. I'll try to rush out there today. We want to straighten things up. Before we get started, as usual, remember to switch off cell phones. Today I'm really happy to introduce another colleague of mine, Professor Rachel O'Malley, who's acting head of the Department of Environmental Studies. We'll have to see what the acting means. Rachel has been at San Jose State for over 15 years, and she's given a lot of thought to how humans fit into ecosystems. For example, in her Ph.D. at the University of California, Santa Cruz, Dr. O'Malley studied rice fields and looked at the invertebrates in rice fields and was able to study them in Sacramento Valley, as well as Thailand and other places. There will be 10 or 15 minutes for questions, so keep questions in mind. We may ask you to talk a little bit about how clear communication is important in your work, Dr. O'Malley. And feel free to walk in front of the screen if you like.
Okay.
Without any further ado, I'll let Dr. O'Malley take it away. Thank you.
So is this on? Is this working? Do you hear it? Okay. No?
It is working. Go ahead. Keep going.
I'll just keep going. Okay. If you can hear me, great. So as you've heard, I come from environmental studies, and we do a lot of work both with engineering because of the impacts that many of the engineering projects that we have out there have on the environment, and then also with engineering in terms of the solutions to some of those problems. And so there's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of dovetailing. I've designed my presentation today to be an absolute awful whirlwind, and I really apologize. What I'm doing is I'm trying to expose the undergraduates in the room and some of our graduate students who are joining us today to the range of things that interest me and why they interest me. So I'm going to just warn you that it's going to be fast, and I'm going to encourage you to come and speak with me if you're interested in the department, and with any of our students if you have more questions. So the big question, the big picture here is, how do we assess the impacts of our actions as engineers, as environmental studies, as policymakers? And the meme that I've used is canaries, right? Who's heard of the canary in the coal mine? Raise your hand really high. Good for you, okay? What do canaries do? Anybody? They die, or they sometimes just faint. But the point is that when the canary keels over, get out fast. And we don't want to get to that point on this planet, because we can't get out fast, right? So the question is, what other ways do we have to assess the environmental health of our planet, and also what we, when we have to get out, which we can't. So how can we get in there before the canary keels over? And most importantly, how do we keep ourselves from being the canary, right? So for those of you who aren't familiar with it, coal miners heading down into airless areas under the earth would bring a canary in a cage. When it keeled over, canaries are more sensitive than we are. So they're a sensitive indicator of lack of air. And at that point, and of odorless gases like carbon monoxide. So this is a point we don't want to get to. I'm going to give you 3 case studies. And within those 3 case studies, there's complexity. And they're case studies of research that I've done over the last 18 years that I've been at San Jose State. 3 different big areas. And the first one is about the Santa Cruz Mountains, and it's about mining in the Santa Cruz Mountains. How many people know there's mining in Santa Cruz Mountains? The elite few. Right. Agriculture. How many people know there's agriculture on the California Central Coast? Okay, more. And then I'm going to give, the final case study is going to be more about what we can do. Not so much about what's going wrong and how panicked we are, but instead what tools do we have to do something about it. And of course the goal is to anticipate, certainly to measure And I say quantify because you don't want to just go out there and say, I know what's right. You actually have to say, this is what's going on, and this is how we know it. To anticipate, which means it's the canary's not dead yet. It's before the canary's dead. And then respond to, and that's to actually prevent the canary from keeling over, as opposed to waiting till it's keeling over and try and get off the planet. So that's the purpose. Now, you see a lot of names here. I want you to write them all down. There's going to be a quiz. This is the people who have helped me. Nothing we do is done by ourselves. Certainly I couldn't have done the work I'm going to present to you right now by myself. These are all San Jose State master's students in the Department of Environmental Studies who have worked with me as their committee chair over the past 18 years. There's nearly 40 people there, and I'm not going to name them all, but I want you to know that nothing I do here is done by me as an individual, and nothing that you do will be done by you as an individual. So remember that it takes a team, and sometimes a really big team. Okay, so the Santa Cruz Mountains and mining. Have you ever been to Santa Cruz Mountains? Good. How about the beach? Yes. So this is a very special place. It turns out it is one of the most special places in the world. It's called the Biodiversity Hotspot. It's cool by the beach, and it's hot in the mountains. It's relatively average rainfall for this area by the beach. It is torrential rainfall in the mountains. In addition, there's pockets. So here's the beach, right? You've all been there? Some of you have been up in here. This area, which is along the ridge, is actually a sea bottom. The sea bottom upwelled over the eons from long before we were here. And what you see up here in the areas that are yellow is sand, sea bottom sand. But it's sea bottom sand that's been packed so tightly that it becomes hard as sandstone. But it's not, it is actually an ancient sea bottom. So in this area, it's called the Zyanti Sand Hills because the soil is awful. The soil is basically sand, very little nutrients, hard for plants to grow, hard for anything to grow. And for that reason, because you've got the cool temperatures down here, you've got the hot temperatures and the hot rain up here, you've got areas that are in between, what you have is pockets of islands. You see how the sandhills look like little islands on this mountain? Can you imagine living in this island right here? If you were an animal or plant that had to live in that island, could you get to this island to go find your friends, or when this island begins to have trouble, to escape and find another place to live? So we think of this as what we call island biogeography. The sandhills have an island-like function at the top of the hills. Why is this important? And what does it have to do with canaries? So what it does is the high variability of both soils and also of microclimates means that you have very, very patchy ecosystems. These patchy ecosystems will have some areas that are grassy and open, and other areas, this is a weird disjunct pine stand that is up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. Most of what you see in Santa Cruz Mountains are redwoods. This is not redwood area. This is weird islands of pines and of sand. But you also see sand mines, right? Where there's sand, there's mines. No, where there are people, there are mines. What do we use sand for? Anybody? Super loud. Glass, yes. This turns out to be a very, very good sand for glass because it's so old that every single grain is very rounded. You know how glass gets rounded over time. Makes it pack tighter, have less air for glass. So it's very high quality, and that's one of the justifications for mining here. What else do we use sand for? What have you used sand for? Louder? Silicon, yes. So it can be used for base product for silicon. How many people have actually worked in silicon? Probably not that many, a few. What have we all, most of us, interacted with that uses most of the sand? Anybody? Concrete, I heard it, concrete. Most of this sand, most of this is going to concrete, right? So what we're doing is we're taking a natural habitat that that is sort of interesting and strange, that is a biodiversity hotspot, which means that because of all of those islands, there are more different species in the Santa Cruz Mountains than there are in all of the Midwest. We have so many species in such a small area. They live here, they live nowhere else on the planet. They've evolved here because it's such a harsh and difficult place. And we need concrete, right? We're engineers. So how do we know when that's okay and how do we know when it's not okay? In order to ask the question of what's going on and is it okay for us to take this sand, are we just taking a little sand and it's no problem, or are we actually destabilizing systems that could end up failing? One thing that one can do, and these are the 4 sub pieces of my first case study, 4 rare species. One is a rat. I promised you in the abstract, if you read it, that I talk about a rat. Another 2 are insects. Do we care about insects? I do. And the last one is a flower. I'm going to go through it really quickly. I apologize. So this is my rat. This rat, if you look at where it's distributed, I think I've got that next. Historically, this is a less pretty version. Historically, there's the sand hills, and all of those white dots are places that this rat existed. That's all the places this rat existed on the planet Earth. It is a rat. Do we care? I don't know. But we do know that it's a kangaroo rat, so you might like it a little better. It's got really big eyes, really cute ears, really long feet. It jumps. It doesn't walk. And I'll tell you, if you work on it, it becomes very, very endearing. But it also is a symbol. It's an indicator. It's an indicator of what we're doing in our relationship with this very, very sensitive environment. So how do we quantify? Remember, the whole point of this is how do we actually measure before we've lost it? How do we measure what we're doing? So the first question is, where is it? Presence and absence. That's a form of measurement. Is it surviving or is it declining in its current, in what we're doing? And one thing I wanted you to notice, it makes cute little burrows too. It lives mostly underground. So the first piece of research that I did in Santa Cruz Mountains actually dates back quite a few years. I'm not sure I put it on here, but it was in the 2000s. We looked at all of the spaces that it had, we looked at museum specimens and looked at all of the places that they'd ever been seen, the Santa Cruz kangaroo rat, Dipodomys venustus venustus, and we went out and we looked for them again. So the open circles are the venustus records. There's a relative that lives farther south, but the venustus records are in the open circles. I'm only going to give you the punchlines. If you want to know about the story more, I'm just going to have to encourage you to come and talk to me. One way that we measure what we're doing, one way that we quantify whether the mines that we are running for our concrete are having an effect or not, it's a gross measure, is to say, this is where they were before 2001. And when we did the study in 2001, this is the only place that there were any kangaroo rats left. It's the Save the Redwoods League property. As you can see, that's the preserved property. That's the property where there's not the mining. That's the property where it's not a quarry, it's not a heavily peopled location. This one, there weren't any in 2001. There hadn't been any previously. We trapped here because it seemed like a nice place for a kangaroo rat, but what do we know about kangaroo rats? They weren't there, they hadn't been there before. The only place that they were persisting as of 2001 was at the Save the Redwood League property. That was very stunning. It was very upsetting because, of course, that means that they had actually disappeared. So that might be too late. When your kangaroo rat has disappeared, maybe you're not measuring sensitively enough. In principle, you could restore habitat, you could connect those islands, bring the kangaroo rat back, but studying rare animals, particularly mammals, is very expensive. It requires a lot of money and resources, and it might not be necessary if we can find another indicator, another ecosystem level indicator of what we can do to improve the damage, to restore the damage that we have created. So are there any other indicators? And that's what gets me into the other two of my creatures. First, the Zyanni bandwig grasshopper. How many people like grasshoppers here? Come on. Grasshoppers are great. They're cute, right? Yeah, yeah. Well, this one is another interesting one in that because it's in the Santa Cruz Mountains, it's in this very rare habitat. First of all, you see the grasshopper? It's pretty subtle. It's very, very cryptic, very small. What makes it, the way you know that it is who it is, it's got this really cool blue leg. It, once again, is a creature that is only found in the sandhills in Santa Cruz County. Again, nowhere else on the planet. So it tells us that this is a species that evolved, and we think of it as co-evolved. There's an ecosystem that's come up out of the ocean, onto the land. We've got the kangaroo rat. In a lot of the same areas is the only place you find the grasshopper. So what got cut off here is, where do I live? We know nothing about the grasshopper. All we know, and when I was brought into this research, it was actually a regulator for the federal government said, we're supposed to protect this grasshopper. We know it's only found generally here, but we have no idea what to do to protect it. We don't know enough about it. Would you be willing to study this grasshopper to find out even what it eats? We don't even know what plants it needs. We don't know anything about it. So again, you can say, I want to save it, it's cute, right? It's cute, it's got a blue leg, I want to save it. But if you don't know how to save it, you can't save it. You don't know what it eats, you don't know what it needs. So that gets into the quantifying. This is work that I did with Jen Chu, and I'll tell you, remember I said it's really hot up in the Santa Cruz Mountains? This habitat is blisteringly hot. The weather we've had the last couple of weeks, it's stunning. Again, only punchlines, that's all you get. And this is a poorly moved onto the PowerPoint. It's kind of hard to read, I apologize. But what I want you to know is one thing that we looked at was, where are they? So you'll see that the numbers are in the 60s because the grasshoppers aren't like the kangaroo rats. The kangaroo rats, if you went back and looked, we had 2 in 100 trap nights. The grasshoppers will have 64 in some locations. They're abundant locally and very limited in their extent. So the first question is, in this case, are invasive plants having an effect on, or do they like invasive plants? Who's heard of invasive plants? Okay, so invasive plants is basically plants that didn't evolve in the location where we're currently trying to manage our impact on the earth. So invasive plants spread rapidly, and they've only come basically as pests of humans. So humans brought grasses for our cows, and those grasses ended up pushing out a lot of the plants that had evolved to support folks like the grasshoppers. So in the places where the grasshoppers were found most abundantly, there were fewer invasive plants. Both of these are invasive plant species, and you'll see that the percent of invasive plants, I was just reading this wrong because that's a percent cover of invasive plants. And that's the average in the ecosystem. The average in the ecosystem was 10% of this and 65% of the Hypocaris glabria. Where the grasshoppers were, there was significantly lower amounts of invasive plants. So that was our one little cue. Well, it looks as though they're inversely correlated with invasive plants. So grasshoppers don't like invasive plants. So we did a little bit of quantifying how they feel about invasive plants. But the question of what are they actually eating and what do they need was a little more difficult. Now, this is an endangered species. You're not allowed to harass, harm, kill, maim, do anything awful to an endangered species. What we were able to do was to collect just a little bit of frass. 15,000 extra points for anyone who knows what frass means. You missed your 15,000 points. To put it delicately, it means droppings or poop. Okay? So we went out, and because we're such great quantifiers, we measured the poop of the grasshoppers. We didn't want to bug the grasshopper, another awful pun, but we did want to know what they eat. And the easiest way to do it was to put them in a little vial just for a second, and they panic and leave their droppings, go away, and then we put them through chemical processes, and we look carefully at their droppings to figure out what is actually in their droppings. So again, we're not saying we love you, grasshopper, we're going to do what we think is best. We're saying what is best? What do you need? Asking questions. Turned out that we found the vast majority of what the grasshoppers had in their frass. Don't you love that word? I want to call my kids, never mind. Lupin. Lupin. Lupin is a poisonous plant, not to the grasshoppers. If we have lupin for our cows, they don't like it, they keel over. But it's a very, very important native, locally evolved species. So what did we learn? We learned that we can't look at what's in the environment where the grasshoppers are, because we saw it as mostly invasives in the small areas they were. We have to say, what are they actually eating? And what they're actually eating was lupin, and then this heterotheca, which is quite pretty as well, Ceciliflora echoides. And both of those are native, and not even particularly beautiful. I mean, it's got a pretty flower every once in a while, but the rest of the time it's kind of shut down. But that's what the grasshoppers were eating. Interestingly, they did have a little bit in their diet of the non-natives. 15% of their diet was non-natives. We don't know if they were happy eating that, but they were at least taking advantage of it. So again, quantifying, that's the purpose. I promised you 4 rare species. The third one is another favorite of mine. How many people love beetles? Come on. There's a famous saying that God must have loved beetles because he made so many of them. This beetle is super, super interesting and exciting, and I'll tell you why. There are Jun beetles that are locally adapted, locally evolved up and down the coast, up and down the Pacific coast, from Mexico all the way up to Canada. We have different Jun beetles that they don't think of themselves as the same, but to us they look pretty similar. In the Zayante Sandhills, we have one that is only found, again, in that same suite of islands in the mountains. This one is called Polyphylla barbata. Anyone think they know why? Barbata? Yep. It's got a beard. You almost got 15,000 points there. That was good. Yeah, so sometimes the frightening scientific names are actually easier to understand than you'd think. But it has this hair because it lives in this awful sand environment, and that keeps its spiracles, or its airways, open, having a nice beard. So Polyphylla barbata. Again, we were asked to understand more about this. What does it need? We're trying to protect it. We're trying to help it. What does it need? Answer, where do I live? What do I eat? So we thought, because this is what the local consultants were saying, that they need to be within 500 feet or 150 meters of those pine trees I mentioned earlier. So if you save a pine tree, you're saving my cool bearded beetle. Sounds good. That's what all of the consultants said. That's what all the consultants did. Turns out that influenced what actions humans took. It influenced where development of shopping malls might be, or houses. Every time a house is built closer than 150 meters to a pine tree, they had to mitigate. They had to pay extra. Well, again, the punchline. We went out and actually watched the beetles, and we looked for burrows. We found females 500 feet from any pine, ponderosa up there. And we looked at their frass, just like we did for the grasshoppers, and we found that there was no pine in their frass, suggesting that this whole metric we'd been using was actually simply wrong. It may have been correlated with some other thing, but it was not what they were using. And what we did find is something that was very trendy and was very difficult to understand, which is mycorrhizal fungi. Anyone know what mycorrhizal fungi are? Okay, if you've ever heard about the trees all being connected and you injure a tree over here and it feels it over there, that's because there's a big network of fungus all underneath a healthy soil that connects the trees. And I know that in your readings for today you had information about forests and forest conservation and management. And mycorrhizal fungi are an area that all of you who want to go into research, there's a lot of unknowns still and a lot of interest in what roles is it playing. In this particular individual, in this particular beetle, it's appearing to be partly food. So in this case, the planting guidelines were very wrong, and quantifying, again, quantifying what they need is the only way to find out what the effects of our actions are. Okay, the last subset of my Sandhills case study, I know, what, we're still in the first case study? The last Sandhills subset is the plants themselves, right? I've talked to you about plants as food for insects, but plants in and of themselves are also very unknown in the Sandhills. So the fourth rare species I want to bring to your attention is the Santa Cruz wallflower, Erythema Again, it's endangered. These are all endangered. Why are they endangered? Super loud. Somebody really brave and loud. Why are they endangered? You have all the information you need right now to know. Yes, they only live in one mountain range, but humans is always part of it, right? So they only live in one mountain range. They've been declining through the years, and what's the big activity that we're doing in that mountain range in their habitat? Mining. Thank you, mining. Although we're also doing other things, which I'll tell you about in a minute. So there's only, depending, 12 to 20 populations remaining in the world. The ones on private property, endangered plants are not protected on private property to any extent. Endangered plants have a different level of protection than even insects. So the ones on private property we just don't even know anything about. The habitat is fragmented. That's when those islands get smaller and smaller. So the question with the wallflower was, they can't even run, right? So are the wallflowers so isolated that their pollinators can't get back and forth to them? So instead of asking, what do I eat? You say, how do I mate as a flower? How do I get around? Can the pollinators get from one to the other? So in this one, we looked at 4 different sites where we knew there were wallflowers. We didn't have access to any other sites with wallflowers at this point. Again, the Bynum Eco Reserve, in this case, there are wallflowers there. Quail Hollow, the Water District land, and the Morgan Preserve. And this was a collaboration not just with my students, but also with their undergraduate advisors over at Santa Clara University and UC Santa Cruz. And what we measured was, first of all, how do you decide if a plant's healthy? You don't ask it. What plants do to make it into the next generation is that they make seeds. And if they don't make seeds, that's the end of them. So that's the #1 problem for plants. It's kind of different than us. We have offspring that are past the seed stage when it moves forward. So for plants, you use a value called fitness, which is how many seeds they make, to indicate whether they're likely to grow or shrink in the future. And what we found is that, I'm going to go back. The question is this population crossing with itself? There are only about 7 or 8 individuals of this flower in this population. So is this population crossing with itself and thereby suffering? Imagine marrying your sister. Right? Marrying your brother. This is what they're doing over here. Maybe. Unless their pollinators, which are insects, are moving their pollen over to a broader genetic pool. We know they've been isolated in islands for millennia, and so they're genetically, potentially, they might be genetically different. Now, if they're really well mixed, then that's not a problem. It's okay that there's one fragment here and one fragment here. But this gets into the question of how do you fix it? How do you restore it? If you need to create a corridor to get their genetic mixing from there all the way over to here, that's one piece of information. But otherwise, you might just preserve these remaining sites and not worry about a corridor. So what we found is that absolutely for this plant, self-pollination, where you take one flower from a plant and you pollinate it with another flower from the same plant, is lethal. If a plant pollinates itself, which plants can do, we don't, this particular plant does not produce seed. This is a fewer than 5 seeds. Whereas a normal plant, an outcross we call it, that crosses with another plant produces more. So the question was, okay, self-pollination appears to be really bad for the plant. But what about those dots I showed you? What if you cross with a neighbor within your population in general, within that little dot? Is that good enough? Or is it really important that you get all the way from Bonnie Doon to the water district? And what we found is that within a population versus across those big distances was a little important. It definitely reduced the success of the plant in terms of making seeds, but between populations was only a little bit better. Now, multiplied over millennia, it might be that you really do need to have a cross. This is a bee flying from the water district all the way over to Bonnie Doon. In the grand scheme of things, it's a little better to be pollinated across that really big divide. But at least it's not lethal to be within your dot. Does that make any sense to anybody? I'm seeing some nods, that's all I wanted. So the last thing we did was no one knows anything about these animals and plants. This is all new. This is all new this decade. This is work that just came out in 2013. These are ongoing research that has to be quantified all the time for us to even know what happens when we're out there mining. So we video trapped. We essentially set up video cameras on the flowers, and we found bees, as we would expect. We also found, here's our bee over here. We also found flies. Flies are pollinating, and flies are really strong flyers, so are bees. And we found butterflies. All 3 of these are very strong flyers, which gives a sense of probably why there's not such a problem, that in fact, they're probably mixing across those islands for this flower. So creating a human-style corridor that gets the flower from here to here may not be as important, because you've got some really strong flyers keeping the whole remaining group mixed up. So I'm just trying to pique your interest and curiosity in the ways that we answer questions of, is this an effect or not? Is this something that's going to be damaging to mine? Is it something that's going to be damaging to use concrete in our cities? All right? So the insects need the plants, and the plants need the insects. That's lovely. Wonderful, you say. What does that matter to me? Right? What if all of those plants and all of those insects were simply to disappear? Who really cares? I know, you all care, but you always have to answer that question. So my second big case study, it would seem like it doesn't sort of follow, but it's agriculture. And some of you are saying, I get it. I don't know. But agriculture, what does agriculture have to do with what we've been talking about? And remember, we're trying to measure, anticipate, and respond to degradation to the environment before it creates conditions that we cannot recover from. Turns out we need insects too. We are mutually benefited by insects, they benefit us. There's a whole movement that's called farming for pollinators that takes this kind of research into pollinators and into rare plants and looks at it in the farmscape. So this is an ideal farmscape from, if you're interested in insects at all, go to the Xerces Society. They're just fantastic, XER. And what you see is a farmscape that looks much more like England than it looks like California. You see your farm rows, you see waterways, you see native vegetation all around it. And why is that? Why do we care? Plants like strawberries. Who likes strawberries? Yeah. Plants like strawberries need pollination. We're not going to go out there ourselves and hand pollinate all of our strawberries. If we don't keep the natural ecosystems healthy, who's heard about bee declines? Okay, we're always looking for a silver bullet. Why are they declining? Well, it's because of this one insecticide. Well, part of it is because of deterioration of the natural ecosystems that we're creating all over the planet. So we need to measure before we've got not enough pollinators. I want to give a shout out to Joanna Johnson and Sutapa Biswas, who both did research on this, and a bunch of other folks who have helped me work with the importance of the non-crop environment on crops. Moving on to my second case study. So I'm going to go through the next two much more quickly because I am quite certain that I'm taking too much time. But essentially, farmers and this is also ties to your readings for next week. I see that you have got a sustainable ag, hopefully talk and readings for next week. So this is going to be pretty tied into what the engineers in the room are having to continue thinking about. And I want you to make that connection. It's not, oh, forests, oh, agriculture. No. In California, there's agriculture amidst our forests and vice versa. So farmers who are sustainable ag, organic farmers, are planting hedgerows of native plants. They're planting pollinator and predator and beneficial insect plants. They call them insectary plants. They're planting them either along the edge like this, or sometimes in rows in the center of the fields. They're using land that they could theoretically be making a maximum profit on to keep their system working and try to prevent the damage that agriculture causes. So for this work, the first work on the hedgerows, are the hedgerows actually making a difference? Farmers do it. No one had measured if it actually makes a difference to do it. There was no quantification of the effect of hedgerows in farm fields. So in this case, Joanna Johnson and I went out to 6 organic strawberry farms. 4 of them had hedgerows and 2 did not. When you're doing work on farm like this, you take what you get. And so for the organics, most of them were doing it. There are only a couple that didn't. But what we found was such a strong trend, that it was such a strong effect, that having a small number of samples didn't matter as much. What we found was that where there were hedgerows, the number of bees was significantly higher throughout the entire planting season. In the hedgerows versus not in the hedgerows. So this is asking the question, is what we're doing fixing things? We're moving from is it hurting things to how can we fix things? Similarly, and I'm going to go through it quickly because it looks so similar, the number of different kinds of bees, and this is important because honeybees, we all know honeybees, right? European honeybees is what they're called. They're not actually native to this country. There's lots and lots of bees that are coming from California that are super important for pollinating both our native plants and agricultural plants that are not European honeybees. So other kinds of bee species, it turns out that the hedgerows were supporting a greater variety of bees as well. And that when we do have European honeybee collapse, we may still have pollinators if we have other kinds of bees. And in fact, the European honeybee is not the one that responds to the hedgerows most. It's actually got, this is the Apis mellifera, the European honeybee. It has a kind of a weak effect. Instead, the humble sweat bee drove a lot of the abundance of pollinators and also the response to the hedgerows. And this is a native bee. It's not a rare bee. It's not an endangered bee. It is, however, a native bee, and it's presumably also supporting a lot of the native plants that evolved over the millennia with it. The other thing that people use hedgerows for, and this is just going to keep new weird concepts one after the next, is so what do we use pesticides for? Insecticides. Who knows anything about insecticides? Okay, insecticides. Insecticides were invented, and this is not my inflammatory language, they were invented as tools of war. And they're invented essentially as nerve poisons. And then they were realized, oh wow, they can kill, most of the insecticides that we use, they can actually kill insects because insects and humans have the same nervous system. Cool. So we started using nerve poisons on insects. Small problem. Insects and humans have the same nervous systems. So we would really not like to use something that is also poisonous to humans, particularly farm workers, in our farm fields. One of the ways that we have tried to understand how not to use insecticides is by using really cool predators and parasitoids and other enemies. So you've all heard of ladybugs, right? Yes, so ladybugs is the one we all know about. Put ladybugs out for your aphids, ladybird beetles. This study is a study that I did recently with Sutapa Biswas looking at spiders. Spiders are not well understood. Ladybugs are really well understood because they're darn cute. Spiders are kind of scary. They're not well understood, but they don't actually hurt humans. In this case, we weren't looking at the hedgerows. We were looking at alfalfa. Alfalfa that's planted between strawberry rows. And the idea here is that spiders can't necessarily make it year-round in a strawberry row, but they might be able to make it year-round if we add in alfalfa. This is something farmers have been doing without knowing how well it's working. And there's a group of folks at UC Santa Cruz and some of the farmers, and then our students have been working with them to try to understand, in fact, sacrificing a row of strawberries for alfalfa, does it have any positive effect on the spiders? So oops, there you go. There's the alfalfa trap crop it's called, and I'm not going to explain that today, but what did we find? I'm not going to talk about the design. We captured them in small cups in the ground called pitfall traps, and what we found was that, in fact, in the alfalfa strips, we had measurably more spiders. Spiders are good. They cause no harm to strawberries. They cause no harm to people. They only eat insects. They are purely carnivorous. So having more spiders means less pesticides. I'm going to go through quickly just to show you that these are sac spiders, which were increased. These are lynx spiders. If anyone's getting excited about studying spiders, the common names will get you if nothing else. And then there are harvestmen, which are really cool. They're daddy longlegs. You've all seen daddy longlegs, right? They turn out to be really resilient, respond really well to alfalfa, and they can survive even when the pest levels are low because they will eat decaying plants and stuff if they have to. So, diversifying farms helps the bees and the spiders that are good for our crops. What else does it do? The last effect, we talk about saving the planet, trying to find things that are going to help rather than just business as usual and then like the canary. Runoff, nutrient runoff from farms, fertilizer runoff from farms is killing our waterways. Turns out, again, I'm only going to give you a really, really, really short one on this one. If you plant grasses instead of mud in your farm rows, the grasses can stop, simple, easy, low technology can stop the nutrient runoff, stop the nitrogen from polluting our waterways, causing birth defects in human populations, having all of the negative impacts of farming off the farm. So just little things like diversifying the farming, the grasses. I have a current student who is working on how this can support birds as well, but I just wanted to give that shout out. Okay, my last case study in my last, I don't know, few minutes. trying to understand how these things work together. This is not a case study that I'm going to give you the research results the way I've been giving you, because I'm sure that your heads are totally full right now. But I want to give you a sense of who I am and why I do what I do. And why I do what I do is actually all about the people, even though it's mostly studying insects. I think of what's going on with our natural systems and our agricultural systems as being critical to our own health and survival. So environmental justice is the concept of responding to environmental degradation before it creates a problem for humans, and in particular, in the urban context where we mostly live. Turns out most humans are in the urban context. So that's where we experience a lot of the degradation. And one of the major issues that affects all of us who tend to live, how many of you live in a wildland area? Great. That's about right. 1 in 100 or so. So most of us are experiencing, at a personal level, the kinds of degradation that come from these activities in our neighborhoods, in urban areas. So I do have some research that I've worked on how we can respond to the things that we identify and how we can actually make a difference. And the main message for these studies is that we can and should take responsibility rather than allowing things to happen. We don't let the canary die. The canary can fight back, and we can be the canaries fighting back. Environmental impact assessment is a tool that we use as engineers to assess whether what we're doing is having an effect or not. And these studies actually quantified how well environmental impact assessment is done, the engineering reports, how well they're done in different neighborhoods. And it turns out neighborhoods with fewer economic resources, with less power, tend to have lower quality environmental impact assessments done. So using these quantitative tools are not limited to wildlands. They're not limited to farm fields. They're also incredibly important for those of us working in the urban environment, using numbers to show where there's injustice. So the other urban direction we can take, one is regulatory and legal, the other is educational. I've done several different projects quantifying how teaching about the solutions to the problems in garden-based education, either in elementary schools, recently in prisons, or in colleges, can in fact change our responses. So let's become the canary in the coal mine. We don't want to be that one. In fact, we want to use the numbers, we want to quantify things carefully, and we want to be like the peregrine falcon on the top of, and keep on top of City Hall. Okay? Thank you. If you want, I can show you the peregrine. Is in a video on that, but thank you.
Dr. O'Malley, so we'd like to have some lively questions. Who has a question for Dr. O'Malley? Yes, go ahead.
It's not so much a question, but I'm thinking that in particular in your research with agriculture, I think it's really important to know that our roots in modern agriculture really have roots in warfare. I mean, a lot of our, like our pesticides, larvicides, and herbicides were created by the military originally. And farm equipment after World War. I mean, who built the first farm equipment? It was military. It wasn't, the contractors. So I think that the whole idea that our modern agricultural industry is built upon warfare begs the question of why we're doing this in the first place.
Yeah, it's interesting. While that's true, and I think it's true at the industrial agriculture level, what is important to remember is that humans actually came out of our evolutionary past with some pretty darn strong agricultural tools. And if you just go back to the 1930s and before, it turns out that we have such a wealth of knowledge of how to grow things without fighting with the environment, but instead living with it, that we need to go back there. Thanks.
So, next question. Well, I have a question. Going back to the bearded beetle example, I mean, we're talking about ecosystem engineers more and more, recognizing kind of in an anthropocentric way that certain species do things in the ecosystem. Does that beetle actually spread the fungi around? Do we know that?
I love that question. Do you want a master's in environmental studies? We could test it.
I'd love to go and test it. What do you think?
We know so little. This beetle, actually, we didn't know what it looked like when it lived underground. The beetle spends 11 months of the year underground as a larva. And it only comes out for 1 month. That's why it's called a Jun beetle. And all it does, you ready, people? You're in college. All it does is come out, mate, and go back in. So, what a life.
Yeah, just a couple of questions.
I think we've answered everything, right?
Okay.
Thank you.
And thanks a lot, Dr. O'Malley.